The national policy was to welcome every arriving Ukrainian refugee by giving them every legal right a Pole has and a place to stay in a Polish person's home and apartment. Abe, that to me, more than anything, characterized my time as ambassador in Poland over the last 3 years, because it was not expected, it was absolutely needed, and it had everything to do, Abe, with the American-Polish relationship.
Thank you all for being here. It's good to see that the work that we've been doing is important and timely. And the ambassador said, Kyron, did you plan this for all that's going on in the world? I kind of think I did. So it's good to have you here, and I think the questions are going to be really very important. So they prepared remarks for me, and I'll read those. Though I'm a professor, I don't like to have a script. I thank you and welcome you all to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I love that new title. My name's Kyron Skinner, and I'm the Tobey Chair Professor, Tobey Family Chair Professor at Pepperdine University, and we're a sponsor. The Commonwealth Club would like to thank Diane and Tad Tobey, Diane is here, of Tobey Philanthropies and Pepperdine University for generously supporting tonight's Tobey Family American Values series program. Other members of the Tobey family are here as well, and we welcome you and thank you for joining us. And I, on behalf of Pepperdine and the Tobey Philanthropies, would like to thank, in particular, the Commonwealth Club World Affairs and Dr. Gloria Duffy, the president and CEO, for bringing us all together tonight. I have to speed up because Abe Silvera said there's not much time, Kyron, go quickly. Ambassador Mark Brzezinski is a distinguished diplomat and attorney. He has served as the U.S. ambassador to Poland, where we met him for 2 years or 3 years in the Biden administration. Before that, he was ambassador to Sweden in the Obama years. He was a Fulbright scholar in the 1990s in the newly post-communist Poland. So he has seen this nation go full circle, and he has worked in both the public and private sector, which I think both were important for the job that he was able to do. In recognition of his distinguished service in Poland, he received the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit from the President of Poland, as well as the Royal Order of the Polar Star by the King of Sweden. So in both roles, he distinguished themselves. These aren't automatic honorary degrees as such, but he was one selected for them. Abe Silvera is a long-term friend of mine. He is the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy and National Security Emeritus at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. As an attorney and a jurist, Judge Silvera served as the U.S. District Judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York and a legal advisor to Secretary Shultz during the Reagan administration. There was a period in his career when many people in New York were upset with him, and they would say, chanting outside, Abe Silvera ain't no fair. So he has had a long career dealing with the public as well. Let me introduce our guest and panelist, Ambassador Mark Brzezinski and the Honorable Abraham Silvera.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you, Abe. Great for me and Olga Leonovich to be here. We love being in the California sunshine. It's cold in Northern Europe these days.
And welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you.
They have been doing this since 1903.
Amazing.
Inviting people who have a lot to say up here to say it. And you're most welcome to be here, and we thank you for that.
Thank you, Abe. Appreciate the invitation.
So since Kyron has set the field and talked about us and the issues. Why don't you start off by telling us about your service in Poland, what the issues were, the big issues that you dealt with, and what remains to be done.
Thank you, Abe, for that introduction. Thank you again to the Taube family for having us here tonight. Let me start by quoting 3 words that hung on a banner in the railroad station in the easternmost part of Poland just after the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine. Hanging on this huge banner over the train station were 3 words: Tutaj jesteście bezpieczni. Here you are safe. Tutaj jesteście bezpieczni. Here you are safe. Who in the world doesn't want to be safe? And that was the way in 2022 the Poles greeted a total of 9 million Ukrainians fleeing across their western border with Poland on that 380-mile border, 8 border crossings, not knowing where to go. Despite the history between Poland and Ukraine, humanity was the response by the Poles. For the first time in history, as a national policy, I repeat, as a national policy, because it was declared by the Polish president on national television, the national policy was to welcome every arriving Ukrainian refugee by giving them every legal right a Pole has and a place to stay in a Polish person's home and apartment. Abe, that to me, more than anything, characterized my time as ambassador in Poland over the last 3 years, because it was not expected, it was absolutely needed, and it had everything to do, Abe, with the American-Polish relationship, because the Poles would not have done it if they did not feel safe. Mm-hmm. And they felt safe because they were part of NATO. They felt safe because there was 13,500 US soldiers spread out all across the country, not by accident. They felt safe because the US military said directly to the Russian military, "We are not part of your fight with Ukraine, but do not come to Poland. We don't invite a fight, but you don't invite a fight as well." And so despite the fact the Poles transferred literally the guns to the Ukrainians that they used to defend themselves against the Russians, an act of treason in the mind of Putin, over the last 3 years, Poland was safe and secure, and the relationship truly became meshed together. The eastern part of Europe was completely safe despite the fact that we were giving lethal munitions to Ukrainians to kill Russians that were attacking them. That, to me, more than anything, captures the essence of what I and the 600 people at the US Embassy in Warsaw tried to do over the last 3 years, cultivate that context.
So there's still the same brave people that we saw during the Reagan administration when Lech Walesa and Pope John II faced up to the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and were not afraid.
Abe, there is a statue across the street from the US Embassy in Warsaw of President Ronald Reagan. It's the only US president celebrated in such a prominent place in the entire country, President Reagan. And he is celebrated there because he is seen as a hero to the 200 million people that occupy the space of the countries that border Russia and Belarus, the Baltics, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and so forth. It was those captive nations during the Soviet bloc that were part of the 26 countries that emerged out of the crumbling of the Soviet bloc. And it was Reagan who believed that those captive nations would become independent sovereign states. And he believed that ultimately they would go from security consumers to become security exporters. And I'm here to report to you that in the last 3 years, that is exactly what happened. Poland, which used to be a security consumer, seeking the protection of American and NATO soldiers from the East, became a security exporter by going all in with the Ukrainians. Because the way the fight was characterized by the American president, Joe Biden, was that this was a collision between autocracy and democracy. This was about values. This was about a way of life and a set of values, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, that we stand for and that we will solidly stand by our allies for. And the Poles were one of the nations that built that out. And it was President Reagan who cultivated that thesis, and he was right.
But he couldn't have built without the sound, brave people that were willing to risk so much to face up to the Soviets. That's what your point.
That's my point. And if I can just kind of speak from the heart and paint this picture, because no one in the Biden administration really expected this. No one expected the reactive mobilization in Poland that occurred after the Russians invaded Ukraine. A reactive mobilization that manifested itself in young people arranging GoFundMe pages to raise money to rent an apartment so that the Adamyuk family coming across at 1:05 a.m. on the Medica border crossing would have a place to stay in, say, Białystok or Poznan or Szczecin, Poland. Or a young woman spearheading a food drive in Białystok for Ukrainian refugees that arrived the previous week, or a group of tech guys in Poland's Silicon Valley of Wrocław organizing with Ukrainian tech guys to make sure that that Ukrainian company that they had founded continues to thrive despite the war going on. Or a group of nurses in Radom that would take their skills to help people coming in with PTSD and all kinds of trauma from Ukraine to help them. That was the grit that you could see hundreds of thousands of times. I have to tell you that in June 2022, when Secretary Blinken held his annual Chiefs of Missions meeting, bringing together, because once a year, all the U.S. ambassadors from around the world meet in Washington, D.C. for a Chiefs of Missions conference at the State Department. And I was the only U.S. ambassador during that June 2022 Chiefs of Missions conference told to report to the Oval Office, to meet with President Biden, and to be able to speak about on one question: what inspires the Polish people to be doing what they're doing? And Mark, can we keep it going? Because we may need more of that. And what I said, Abe, was, Mr. President, to the Poles, this is 1939. This is an invasion by a horrific attacker, except this is a time that they're doing something about it and can do something about it. And, and can they do more of it? I would constantly go around the nation and poll mayors, NGO, community organizers, activists, and so forth, whether more Ukrainian refugees, if needed, could be taken in. And despite the fact that the country was saturated with refugees, the answer in the four corners of Poland was, Mark, it'll be hard, but we can take in more because they are our neighbor. That was the humanity shown by the Polish people, but it didn't just happen. It didn't just fall from the sky. It happened because the Poles felt bezpieczny, safe i zabezpieczona, secure. And they felt that way because the U.S. was absolutely rock solid with them. And they felt safe and secure. That is an important element that I cannot overemphasize.
I was going to let you speak some more about that. You were the U.S. ambassador to Poland, and now things are different. A month ago, we had a change of government. And we're not talking partisan politics here. Right. We're talking about the interests of the United States, the interests of Europe, the interests of the freedoms you talked about, the values. Tell us how you think we're doing now.
Sure. Well, the starting point for me, Abe, is, regardless as to whom one voted for in November, Donald Trump is our president, and it's in the American interest that he be a successful American president. And so I did all I could to help the transition team that came through Warsaw to kind of speak to them about what Poland offers. And it was interesting to me that when the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, published an op-ed in the Financial Times last week about the deal between the Trump administration and Ukraine, the Treasury Secretary invoked the case of Poland as the model of a country that America aspires for Ukraine to become, to go from a developing context to a thriving political democracy and free market. And that is exactly how I hoped the country would be characterized as we go into the new Trump administration. First of all, it is good that President Trump is interested in Ukraine. It is good that he's looking for a way for the Americans to be directly involved and as protagonists regarding the future economy and hopefully security of Ukraine. It is also true that timing in life is everything. There have been previous episodes of the US government invoking the economic context when we would go into a war context. In the case of getting the Iraqis out of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, the Saudis ultimately paid for the American engagement there, and that wasn't just by chance. That was very carefully brokered, quietly, behind the scenes, before the battle began. Lend-Lease, for example. We have a situation, though, in Ukraine where the Ukrainians are truly a pulverized and broken nation thanks to the Russians. The video coming out of Ukraine over the last 3 years has been reminiscent of World War II, with children being bussed away into Russia, into unknown destinations, the rape and torture of Ukrainian people, the pulverization of innocent civilians targeted specifically, schools being targeted, and so forth. To me, the kind of the kind of prioritization of the mineral context and the economic context is, to me, sending a message to the 200 people in that zone around Russia who very much believe that America engages first and foremost on the basis of values, on the basis of advancing the value of democracy and freedom and human rights and against genocide. What has happened in Ukraine has been defined by the United States as genocide, formally. And so the invocation of the deal to me seems to be,
you mean the mineral deal? The mineral deal.
The mineral deal seems to be, unfortunately, as having as one of its side effects, demoralizing and the people of the countries around Russia and raising anxiety and uncertainty to virtually unprecedented levels, literally since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. We will have to see how all this evolves. President Trump, obviously, is very transactional in nature. I've had a chance to meet with him once, one-on-one. I took part in a meeting with the Polish-American community in which President Trump took part telephonically. He sometimes can be takes a disruptive approach to advancing a particular argument. We will see how this goes.
Like Ukraine invaded Russia.
Yeah, well, exactly. Or even accusing the president of Ukraine as not having been fairly elected and so forth. Those obviously are specious arguments, and we will see where this goes. It is clearly the case that a failed state in the heart of Europe will not advance American interests. If Ukraine becomes a failed state, a 50 million person country in the heart of Europe, it will have a suction effect on Europe. And that will have an impact on the American economy and on American interests in a number of different ways. We're watching how this evolves. President Zelensky is coming to Washington to sign this deal on Friday. I believe that the negotiation has made this deal a little bit more one of parity, but I haven't seen the actual deal, so I don't know.
And the problem that you face as ambassador, the joy you derive from being part of NATO and representing the most powerful force in the world as a leader of NATO, you have to look, and we want to know your opinion about what the future of NATO is at this point.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Abe, because the power of NATO and the power of America's military preponderance through NATO and directly, of course, produces hard security as one of the things that's derived from it. But other things are derived from the preponderance of the American military and NATO in a place like Poland as well. What are they? For example, democracy. When I was confirmed by the US Senate to become US ambassador to Poland, my very first meeting as US ambassador was with Poland's ambassador in Washington, because the American television station in Poland, owned by Warner Discovery, was facing extinction. The then center-right quasi-authoritarian government was about to sign a law that would have taken away the license of what is called TVN, which is an objectively neutral American platform in Polish language that is a real anchor for democracy in that country. And what I said to the Polish ambassador in Washington, and this is the kind of deal-making that one can do as an ambassador overseas, was, look, you're seeking high-level connectivity with the top Biden team, the president, the national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. I'm seeking your veto of this law that would make extinct TVN. We have a deal to be made here. You can do your part, and I will promise you as the sun comes up tomorrow that I will do my part. To his credit, the president of Poland vetoed the deal that would have made extinct TVN, and I was able to deliver, roughly 2 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, high-level connectivity between President Biden, the Secretary, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Defense, which became a really good investment once the Russians invaded Ukraine, because there was already a robust dialogue going on between our principals that had a really important impact when crises happened, because about 3/4 of a year later, an errant missile, a kind of poorly fired missile from the Ukrainian side, came into Poland and tragically killed 2 Polish farmers in Przewodów, Poland. And the news was breaking out with all kinds of statements that the Russians had fired this missile, that World War III was breaking out, that NATO had been attacked, and that we were going into kind of a military posture vis-a-vis the Russians. And because there was a robust conversation going on between our presidents, our national security advisors, and so forth, our president, who was in Bali at the time, immediately was able to connect with President Duda. The top teams were able to connect on 3 things. 1, what happened? Where was this missile actually from? And we were able to deploy the US Army and Polish combatants to get pieces of this missile to determine where it came from. It came from the Ukrainians. 2, we were able to jointly message to our respective populations what had happened. Not what we think had happened and what each side was going to say had happened, but we were able to have a unity in terms of a message. And 3, the following morning, we were able to coordinate in NATO headquarters at the NATO Council about what had happened and about what we would do next. And so this initial brokering of high-level connectivity between the Poles and the Americans had good consequences subsequent as well. But democracy was one of the things that the US troop presence could also produce, because we were able to leverage their presence and say they are here not to protect a political leader. They're here not to protect a political party, but to advance values, and the Poles understood what we were saying.
Let's dig a little deeper into the NATO issue. The President Trump has insisted that NATO members pay up more for their protection. And a lot of people who love NATO, who believe what you just said, is a good example of how NATO contributes to peace and the advancement of freedom, agree with President Trump that NATO members should pay up more. And do you see any hope in the fact that sometimes a good point can be made and perhaps a better relationship can be created?
Yes, and I think that President Trump is spot on in terms of having NATO members pay a more equivalent and reasonable amount for the value of defense. And his words have had consequences positively already. The UK Prime Minister will be in Washington day after tomorrow, and the UK has announced a substantial increase in terms of what it will pay for defense. The polls are now close to 5%. That's important because the polls have, I think, the largest or one of the largest now militaries in all of Europe. And when you combine that fact with the fact that they will be equipped with Apache helicopters, HIMARS, Patriot systems, F-35s, it is a true defense the Poles will be able to execute on the eastern border of NATO. You know, we have to remember that NATO was based on the Atlantic Charter. That's a page and a half long that really crystallizes the essence of NATO as being basically the unity of purpose, despite very different countries, a unity of purpose around a shared definition of the challenge. Despite the different nature of all these countries that are part of NATO, in many ways it's been, you know, frankly, a shared understanding that Russia presents a threat as manifested in Ukraine. Putin is 71 years old. He's a KGB agent who's the son of a KGB agent. The Russians, tragically, have suffered 700,000 casualties in their invasion of Ukraine. You know what they say about payback, and I think the East Europeans and Central Europeans are within their rights to be very worried about what a KGB agent who is the president of Russia has in mind for them. KGB agents, as a matter of their training, are trained to wait and wait and wait until their target shows vulnerability. And I think that's what Putin will do with regard to what the Central Europeans have done, which was to support the Ukrainians. And so NATO has to be able to defend itself, and this increase in expenditure to make militaries truly practicable contributors to NATO makes a lot of sense. I will say also that America is irreplaceable. There are NATO troops all around Poland, but it is clear that the 13,500 American troops who have served in Poland, that was the high point, spread out all across the country, and we were able to build 19 augmentation centers for them throughout Poland, mostly in eastern Poland, were the true kind of things that made the deterrence that kept, I feel, the Russians away from coming into Poland, either visibly or less visibly, to conduct hybrid activities.
I'd like to, since we have you here, you've had a wonderful background for your job. We're seeing a number of appointments that don't quite match the situation that we can enjoy vis-a-vis your own background with a college and law school and Oxford and also you were involved in politics. You helped 2 presidents get elected.
That's right.
Or 3 maybe, and then you served in Sweden a full term as ambassador, and now you've completed a full term as ambassador in 2 of our most important countries. How did you find the Foreign Service? How did you find the people who served you? How many people served you in Poland?
600 plus.
600.
Yep.
Tell us
larger
about
mission.
them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about them.
Thank you. And thank you also, Abe, for bringing up the prep to go into this service. I want to say that having done a Fulbright scholarship in Poland in the early 1990s, writing a book on Poland and learning Poland from the street, learning a bit of the language, learning the people, beginning a network back in the early 1990s, one, and two, running a smaller mission. U.S. Embassy Stockholm is about 220 people versus 600 plus in Poland, were exactly the things I needed to go to Warsaw in January of 2022, because Warsaw would not have been the place for on-the-job training. Learning what each function at an embassy does. Because what an embassy is, folks, it's an overseas encampment of Americans who are there to conduct many different activities. We had 25 different sections at the U.S. Embassy, ranging from the obvious defense and public affairs and political to agriculture, FBI office, DEA office, and so forth. And I say all that because what you have with those 25 sections is a whole of government approach to engaging a crisis. There were agriculture dimensions to the crisis in Ukraine that we were able to deal with because of our agriculture specialists at the U.S. Embassy. One of the things I'm most proud of in terms of the exodus of refugees from Ukraine into Poland was the fact that we were able to prevent human traffickers from getting a foothold at the refugee points as they were arriving into Poland, despite the fact that Central and Eastern Europe is an area where a lot of human trafficking occurred. And I say that because as soon as the crisis broke out, when you saw these long lines of thousands of people, some of whom have been standing in line for 3 or 4 days, it was mostly women and children. And as soon as I saw that, I went to our FBI office and I said, let's get underway our human trafficking experts with the Ministry of Justice here and the Ministry of Interior, because that's the ministry in Poland that manages the border crossings, and set up task forces to address the potential of human traffickers getting a foothold in that part of the country. And one of the things that was very interesting to me, that wouldn't have been self-evident to me, that the FBI shared with me, is that the police forces in Poland have knowledge actually of who the traffickers actually are, and that they were able to send undercover details into train stations, bus depots, and so forth. And they were able to pick out, oh, there's a trafficker, and we're going to go up to him and we're going to say that we're now giving him 3 minutes to get out of here, or we're going to come down hard on him. And that worked. That kept the human trafficking to an absolute minimum. Each one of those dimensions, the USAID dimension, the foreign assistance dimension, was absolutely critical to setting up Western NGOs like World Central Kitchen at the most useful places where they deployed their staff and their personnel, who were coming in from all over the world to support the Ukrainian refugee influx into Poland. As a U.S. Embassy, we also took on all of U.S. Embassy Kiev. U.S. Embassy Kiev shut down as soon as the invasion began, and all their staff came to Warsaw. So we set up, first of all, much of that staff at U.S. Embassy Warsaw, but also we set up an annex of the U.S. Embassy in Rzeszów, Poland, so that we had embassy staffers literally on the border to help out, to keep an eye on things, to be able to coordinate with the U.S. military, because the 82nd Airborne flew in within 96 hours, including some literally dropping out of airplanes in parachutes to land nearby Rzeszów, and we set them up at a coliseum in Rzeszów. All that had to be very carefully coordinated. I say this, Abe, because I had seen on television the evacuation of Kabul, out of the Kabul airport, which had, according to the State Department report on it, many setbacks and failures associated with that. I knew that we were looking at an exodus out of Ukraine into Poland. And I made it as an embassy task for all 600 employees. We have to make a scientific understanding of the 8 border crossings that are on the 380-mile border that separate Poland and Ukraine. We have to know every lane, every parking lot, every regional hospital, every regional airport, every veterinarian, because sometimes when refugees travel, they bring their pets. And we did that so that we were, by February 22nd, 2022, ready for game time, ready for a massive influx of people who would have all kinds of needs. And frankly, thank God, it went like clockwork. But that was thank God to the Poles, because they came in and they did the heavy lift of taking refugees and putting them in many cities all around Poland.
And you had the capacities that you needed to address all those issues in your staff.
We did. We had, and you know this, Abe, every diplomatic corps in the world has different proficiencies. And the Americans throw people at problems. We tend to really staff out our problems, whether domestically or overseas. And so we were able to bring in a lot of people who had been detailed to other embassies around the world to help on the border, to process refugees, to help USAID distribute food and water, find shelter, clothing, schools for kids, jobs for adults, and this type of thing. We had a massive influx of US personnel from around the world and from Washington, D.C., complemented by international organizations like UNICEF, the UN, the IMO, others, complemented by NGOs like, Polska Akcja Humanitarna, like, a World Central Kitchen, like many, many others. And we were able to have an organizational framework in place which the refugees literally flowed into. Thankfully, along the Polish-Ukrainian border, there's a lot of trucking in between Ukraine and Poland, because Ukraine is a big commodities and agriculture producing country. And so there's a lot of trucking between Poland and Ukraine, which means that there's a lot of trucking depots along the border that just do logistics. And we were able to literally rent huge trucking centers, which normally would have all, hundreds of 18-wheelers coming through every day, as a place where all these NGOs and relief organizations and volunteers and US government and foreign government participants in the relief set up. We also had a daily meeting of all the foreign governments at the border, which would include, of course, the Poles and the Germans, but also the Australians, the Koreans, the Japanese, who quickly jumped in to help out.
I want to ask you about one of your personal projects as ambassador. Okay. You introduced a program for improving the mental health of, I guess, diplomats or people through diplomacy, or increasing. There are many of us here who think we should be thinking domestically about the same problem, but we know that you had a special interest in that, and I want to hear about it.
Thank you, Abe, for that question, and let me not be dishonest and take credit for that idea myself, because it really came from my partner, Olga Leonovich, who is right here, who said quite clearly, America has a mental health crisis, we all know that, and Poland has a mental health crisis. And resilience is all about being honest about challenges. And it was brilliant. We became the only US embassy in the world to spearhead a mental health and diplomacy initiative with the Poles, which meant using the power that any US embassy or US ambassador has in the world, and that is the power to convene, to bring together the different stakeholders of a challenge around one table to talk about what we face. What were the problems that we were looking at in Poland? Poland has, at 38 million people, a grand total of 600, I repeat, 600 psychiatrists. That is obviously radically too little. It also now has over 1 million permanent Ukrainian refugees all of whom have experienced upheaval, many of whom have experienced much, much worse, and face isolation simply by being a refugee in the country. The country was suffering from something that other countries have also grappled with, including America. And so, thanks to Olga, we pulled together a mental health and diplomacy initiative in which we brought together ministries that weren't speaking to each other in the Polish government: education, mental health, and family. We brought together NGOs that would focus on it, like Martina Wojciechowska, hospitals, mental health practitioners, and many other stakeholders, the result of which was a conversation that the World Health Organization then joined us on and drew in the Polish government, and to report to you results, a 4.2 billion zloty commitment, which is a $1 billion in US dollars. A $1 billion commitment was made by the Polish government within 8 months of that mental health and diplomacy initiative being initiated. A $1 billion commitment was made by the Polish government to raise the roof in terms of mental health support in a place that needs it, and that's Poland. I was incredibly proud of that initiative because it truly, truly helped people. It truly, because in the end, diplomacy has to mean something to people. Whether it was mental health, which we spearheaded, or gender equality, which we spearheaded, or spearheading initiatives for peoples with disabilities, which, none of which had been done at the US Embassy before. All of those produced a dialogue that really brought to decision makers issues that weren't being effectively addressed before. And that, to me, Abe, is what an embassy needs to do. An embassy has to be in tune with the challenges of our time. It is easy. It is easy for an ambassador or an embassy to fall into a routine and to do less rather than more. And I couldn't be more proud with what U.S. Embassy Warsaw did in the last 3 years in terms of traditional, conventional engagement, military, business, and also the new stuff, energy, nuclear, for example, civil nuclear power, and also mental health.
We appreciate that, and in San Francisco, we care about gender.
Yeah.
We care about gender equality. We care about it, and we are worried about it. And I wonder if you might comment about how difficult it would be now to serve in a place like Poland and to deal with issues like mental health, gender equality, racial equality.
Yeah. Well, look, what I wanted to do as ambassador and to join my partner in undertaking this was to, frankly, shake up the norm a little bit in Warsaw and use the platforms that we had to do that. So, for example, any U.S. embassy in the world has a representational house, a U.S. residence in the capital. I made it a requirement for my staff in developing guest lists at the U.S. residence to come up with a guest list as close to 50-50 men, women, age differential, also including groups that had historically not been included in Poland, to make sure a activity or an event at the embassy would reflect the true patchwork quilt of Polish society. And I think, and also I wanted to increase the numbers of people coming in to within the four corners of the embassy walls. I met too many Poles, frankly, Abe, who had never been to an embassy, didn't know what an embassy did, and viewed it as kind of a rarefied environment not accessible to them. That to me was not okay. An American embassy is a people's house, and it's the American people's house in Poland, and all are invited. And so we held a July 4th party this past July 4th. I was told this couldn't be done, but with 1,300 people at the U.S. residence. Thankfully, no one pulled the fire alarm, let's put it that way. and we wanted to be inclusive and we wanted to kind of break the convention in terms of who was being invited, because again, an embassy can fall back on a routine guest list, who's there, and that kind of thing.
Before I start taking questions from the audience, I wanted to tell you that I knew your father.
Yeah.
I was privileged to have met him. And when I was doing the Taba negotiation between Egypt and Israel to complete the peace treaty, a very complicated situation developed. And I talked to Secretary Shultz. He said, why don't you talk to Brzezinski? And a couple of other people who were there. And I had lunch with your dad. And I must say, not only did he give me good advice, I had the good sense to follow it.
Thank you.
I want to know, and I'm sure everyone here does, it's very special when you have a father like him.
It's true.
He was National Security Advisor at a crucial time, and incidentally played a crucial role because he differed from the president in many ways. He was really a complement to the president. The president had certain abilities. He had other abilities.
It's true. Yeah.
Tell us about your relationship with him. What impact did that have on your decision? Was it sort of like John Adams and Quincy? I mean, was that what?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I'm incredibly proud of my father and his service. And that is an amazing American story, because my father didn't speak English until he was 15 years old, had polio when he was little, came to America with $200 in his pocket and a partial scholarship to Harvard, and by age 50 was the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States with the name Zbigniew Brzezinski, only in America, folks. Let me say that. 1. 2, he shared with me at the signing of the amazing agreement that you worked on, Abe, historic in terms of the history of the Middle East, the longest lasting peace treaty in the history of the Middle East is the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Produced security dividends for the entire region. Incredibly important. He said to me that this would have never happened unless President Carter was willing to risk his presidency to get it. And that to me is what public service is about. You don't go after these jobs to be a president, but you go after these jobs to do something as a president. And I feel that that's what I learned from my dad. In terms of my relationship with my dad was an incredible teacher. He was a tough taskmaster, folks, I can tell you that. He would ask me, my sister, and brother to talk about détente and SALT I and SALT II, arms negotiations, and we were like age 8 around the dinner table. And so it was a little like that. But I would also say that at the hardest times, he would share the best life lessons. And one thing I've taken with me for my entire life is he said to me once, don't let a setback be a defeat, which is something that brings you down and keeps you down. Let a setback be a disappointment that you grow from, that you learn from, and you ultimately thrive from. And he described the story of when he was a young professor at Harvard, a Polish immigrant to America, teaching at Harvard, on his way to becoming a tenured professor when one day the faculty voted to deny him tenure and to send him away. And he and my mom had expected to be an academic couple in Boston for the rest of their life, and they had to change everything. And they went to New York, and my father taught at Columbia, which was then not a strong program, set up the School for International Public Affairs, but much more importantly, diversified, reached out to Wall Street and became an advisor to Wall Street bankers, in addition to being a professor. And by being an advisor to Wall Street bankers, he got much closer to politics, frankly speaking. And it set up the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, and they invited a couple young governors to join the Trilateral Commission, one of whom was then Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. After Watergate, my father said, you should run for president. In 1977, my father was National Security Advisor to President-elect Jimmy Carter, something that would have never happened unless he was tossed out of Harvard. And he would share that story to my sister, my brother, and me whenever we had disappointments and setbacks in our life. And that was the kind of guy he was. He was a great teacher. He was tough as nails, but a great teacher. And that's the way I'll always remember him.
That's excellent.
But I was very different than him, I can say that. And I'm sure that I did things as ambassador in Poland that he would have never done. And he would have done things as ambassador that I could have never done. And so that's the way I see it as well.
Excellent. So we turn to questions from the audience now.
Thank you.
And here's a good short one. What advice would you give Zelensky right now?
What advice would I give to Zelensky right now? To work with what you have in the best sense of the word. President Trump is transactional, but he also has goals. President Trump wants to be a peacemaker. And peacemakers, as you can see in the case of Jimmy Carter, peacemakers, even in the case of Jimmy Carter, can win the Nobel Prize, for example. President Trump has the possibility of being a great peacemaker, not only if he gets a ceasefire imposed in Ukraine, but if he comes up with a solution that is win-win, win-win, meaning it brings a ceasefire and an end to the tragic bloodshed between Russia and Ukraine. But what has not been talked about yet by President Trump and his team is the future of Ukraine and the possibility of having what I think will be left of Ukraine as a thriving European country. And in this way, President Trump, I think, could join the ranks of the most successful peacemakers in American presidential history if he comes up with a solution that brings security and prosperity out of bloodshed and torment in Ukraine. If he comes up with a solution that, of course, includes what he's negotiating now, and that's this fund jointly controlled by the Americans and Ukrainians on minerals, but also with a plan that maximizes the potential of this country in the heart of Europe, so geostrategically very important and very central, that maximizes the potential of the heritage of great science and physics in Ukraine, and maximizes the improvisational and innovative quality that we have seen in grand form during the fight between Ukraine and Russia on the part of the Ukrainians, and brings true prosperity to Ukraine and all of Central Europe. Folks, that is totally possible. Ukraine has the potential of being a truly prosperous country. And the legacy of President Trump's kind of statesmanship or brinksmanship, whatever you want to call it, the legacy of President Trump's actions today could produce prosperity out of the bloody fields of the battlegrounds of Ukraine. If he does that, he will be seen as a success. And I think President Zelensky can very much set the table with President Trump on that. And the other leaders of Central and Eastern Europe can deliver on that. I can report to you, the Poles are poised to help on a rebuilding and a modernization of Ukraine that would raise the rooftops in terms of the prosperity of the country. President Trump has that in the offing of his leadership if he seeks to bring it that way.
We understand, given your background and your values, how passionate you feel about that. But I can tell you, looking at these questions, there are two themes that run through them, and they're both themes of anxiety. One is, can Poland count on NATO?
So Poland has already benefited from a collective defense that is the product of NATO, and there are huge benefits and efficiencies reported to the rest of NATO, including the American people, from that. Poland has not been anxious and uncertain. It has felt safe and secure, and it has Americans like to have economic efficiencies reported to them. I can report to you that the fact that NATO made Poland feel safe and secure has an economic efficiency reportable to the American people to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. To maintain and support all these refugees would have taken billions of dollars on the part of the West had those refugees gone further west. To do the shipments of assistance, lethal and non-lethal, into Ukraine would have cost billions of dollars had the Poles not done what they did, and they did it because they felt safe and secure. NATO,
Thanks to NATO.
exactly. NATO works. NATO is an economic efficiency creator. I believe that President Trump sees that. I gather that the Polish president visited him last Saturday and pledged the continuation of the presence of American troops in Poland. And there are thousands of American troops there now, and pledged his support for a strong NATO in the future. That makes tremendous sense. Should NATO become diluted, should NATO dissolve, naturally that would raise the level of anxiety and uncertainty in Eastern Europe in a massive way. That would ultimately be something that we in the West would have to pay for, because the Central Europeans would be adept in making the case to the West that our security and their security are interdependent.
The other thread of anxiety is, are we cutting out our capacities that you described earlier, USAID, expertise from different departments of our government that enabled you to be an effective ambassador in Poland and before that in Sweden? Are we deliberately destroying our capacity to be the great country we've been?
Well, Abe, I would even take it higher than that. And I would say this, to my fellow Americans here: the source of American power in Poland or anywhere in the world is not ultimately the strength of our military or the strength of our economy, but the attractiveness of the values we stand for. That statue of Reagan across the street from the US Embassy is there because of the values of democracy and freedom and human rights that many Americans risked their lives and gave their lives to defend over decades and decades of sacrificing for other people's freedoms. So when an American diplomat in Warsaw says something, it means a hell of a lot more than if it was just based on kind of business contracts or military strength alone. America's ideology is profoundly attractive around the world. China's ideology is not. We are, by definition, ultimately more effective in getting the decisions that we want to get abroad because of the attractiveness of our ideology. The implementers of our ideology, in part, are USAID, where we help the weakest and most vulnerable who can't help themselves. That is an investment in American legitimacy that every business person in this room who does business abroad benefits from. Because there's nothing when you're abroad like being linked to the Americans, business-wise, in terms of a university or some other place, because of that attractive ideology. If we undercut that, we undercut a source of raw American power. It's not something that's kind of soft and not measurable and kind of fluid and not you're not able to clarify it. Folks, this is real leverage that we Americans have abroad, whether in government or in the private sector. By being an American, we are part of a very attractive value system to people elsewhere in the world. It is a big mistake to break that.
So one more question, because we're running out of time, and it's a good question. The questioner wants to know: we've been supporting Ukraine as a people, as a nation. Europe has been supporting Ukraine. What could we do today to show our support, our continued support for freedom in Ukraine?
What can we do to support the fight for freedom in Ukraine? I think a couple things. I think by being active and publicly involved Americans, we are doing a patriotic duty. Critiquing a president's approach is not unpatriotic, but in fact the essence of patriotism. All of us want the American president to be successful. We have a self-interest in that. But there is nothing wrong in saying a policy or an approach undercuts the true power of what it means to be an American or an American approach abroad. 1. 2, the Ukrainian people need help in every possible way. May I tell you, as U.S. Ambassador to Poland over the last 3 years, how proud I was of all the Americans who poured into Poland, the Taube Foundation, many others, to give, to share. The generosity of spirit was incredible. I bore witness to some incredible things. I got a text message from David Zaslav, who is the president of Warner Discovery, saying, Mark, this is soon after the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia war. I'm adding on to our text exchange here, Steven Spielberg. He wants to do something for Ukraine. And he texted in follow-up to that text, Mark, through my Heartlands Foundation, I'm doing a check right now for $1 million straight up for Ukrainians in Poland. What else can I do? That happened thousands and thousands of times. Americans poured into Poland to volunteer at the border for groups like World Central Kitchen. People did things little and big, hosting Ukrainian refugees and sharing, and that needs to continue, because if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, the suffering has been inflicted on the Ukrainian people, and it will take a lot to build that society, repair that society. This is a traumatized people. You'll have 700,000 Ukrainians coming back from the battlefield who have gone through unbelievable trauma. That will take resources and expertise to solve. I love how the Ukrainian American community has mobilized, but it's not enough. We need more help. If the people of San Francisco, the people of California, it's not too hard to go on the internet to see what World Central Kitchen is doing, to see what many of the other charities are doing there. Please do that. This is a people that needs your help, and they'll need it going forward.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your ideas.
We're honored to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Abe. That was really, really nice. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.